Tonight, before we begin a more formal study of the Pythagorean doctrine of numbers, I'd like to point out a number of points which perhaps have caused confusion in the public mind. Pythagoras used number symbols almost exclusively as hieroglyphical figures to represent essential phases of universal law. It is not known to what degree he was involved in what we call today numerology. It is not certain that Pythagoras himself practiced divination by numbers. It is possible that he did so, but by no means is it proven. The scanty records that have survived would seem to indicate that numerology developed considerably later, and sometime after the death of Pythagoras and his legitimate disciples. The association between letters and numbers is possible in the Greek alphabet, in which letters are used in pagination and in place of numbers in many instances. We know there is a peculiar divinatory device called the wheel of Pythagoras, which shows apparently the numerical equivalent of letters and vice versa. This wheel, though attributed to him, is not with absolute certainty associated with his name. He is said to have possessed a wheel of letters and numbers, but whether that which has survived is authentic, we do not know. It would not be likely that the Pythagoreans would have used numerology in the popular way in which we have been inclined to employ it. It is more likely that this system developed after the decline of the great philosophical schools. The relation between letters and numbers exists not only among the Greeks, but in various parts of Asia. And a Kabbalah of number-letter associations will be found in a number of systems. But we cannot say with certainty that our present numerology is Pythagorean, nor can we bridge the unfortunate difficulty of language changes, inasmuch as the letters of our alphabet do not correspond with those of the Greek closely enough to justify following their rule and transposing it to our modern alphabet. Thus we may say that numerology in the practical or popular sense of the term is an entirely different matter and should not be confused with the Pythagorean symbolism of number. To them, number was a very sacred mystery, to be used only in the exploration of the great science of wisdom, or the great art of knowing truth. Thus, we cannot confuse them, nor can we necessarily discredit the possibility that Pythagoras did have some divinatory concept. The Greeks practiced many forms of divination in his time, and it was customary and usual to form oracles in a number of ways, including from the flight of birds, from the gathering of clouds, from the changing of winds, from the entrails of sacrificed animals, and in many other manners. Pythagoras was accredited with knowing the future, with having a tremendous internal mystical apperceptive power Therefore many legends have gathered around him, and many arts and beliefs have been attributed to him. There was a period during the medieval era in human history in which a great number of books were fabricated and attributed to ancient authors. Among these we might note in passing Aristotle's supposed essay on midwifery, which is not quite authentic. We may also put under the same heading the mysterious 6th and 7th books of Moses, of which the prophet undoubtedly knew nothing. Yet this was a time when catchpenny productions had fascination for the public mind, and wonderful names were associated with some very bad work. This all adds up to these points which we wish to make. Theon of Smyrna, one of the earliest and greatest of the Pythagoreans, does not mention divination in his great thesis on numbers. It would seem that he might have done so had it been part of the original system. It is not recorded by Iamblichus in his Life of Pythagoras, nor is it reported by Plato, although he makes use of Pythagorean number. We do, however, find comparatively early evidence of numerical speculation in relation to divination, but little prior to the 8th or 9th century, so AD. So we have these problems which we merely point out in passing. Now, for the convenience of those who are interested in classifying materials, I have tried to work out a very simple keyword system as to the Pythagorean approach to number. And as the Pythagoreans particularly use number in connection with archetype or the monadal forms of number, I have followed their system and have selected one word which, as far as possible, summarizes at least a phase of their association between number and power. And therefore, those of you who are interested, I'll read off this list to you rather slowly so you can copy it if you would want to do so. This is merely a keyword analogy, but perhaps it will assist us in the further discussion of the subject. We will use their form then. Instead of the one, we will say the monad. And perhaps the nearest thing to a keyword is identity. Now, in using it as a keyword, we summarize Pythagorean statements such as the numeral of sameness, or that number which is without dissimilarity, or that number which alone knows itself. Many such statements as this seem to carry the general tone of identity with the several meanings of this word. Our own identity is our own monad. The identity in things represents not only themselves as identified, but also common identity. That the same selfness in each is to be regarded as an identity with all other selfness. So in terms, those things which are of a causal nature, approaching the throne of deity, are said to possess identity. Identity with self. Identity with all self. Identity with deity. And the numeral or the numeration, the monad, carries this thought. The number 2, or the duad more completely, is the Pythagorean symbol of dissimilarity. We have already implied that they regarded it as an ill number. They did so because it represents things about which differences are to be noted. It is a number of illusion because difference is illusionary. It is a number of ignorance because illusion, particularly the illusion of separateness, is the root of ignorance. Ignorance is therefore transformed into wisdom to the degree that unity is brought out of division. Therefore, perhaps also the Pythagorean term chaos is appropriate to the duad, whereas cosmos would be more appropriate to the monad. Therefore, dissimilarity is not only essential difference, but the acceptance by the mind of the appearance of difference. Dissimilarity also includes comparison, for by means of it we are tempted to elevate parts above each other and to attempt to achieve to a comprehension of good without overcoming the primary evil, which is division. Therefore, of two or more things, we may say this is good, this is better, this is best. Yet none of these three can be best, because only the one can be best. Anything that is not the one cannot be elevated to a superlative position. Elevation, therefore, in Pythagorean thinking, is motion toward unity. And things divided cannot be supreme, although because of the imbalance of divided parts, one may be greater or lesser than another. Yet always, totality alone is superior to parts. Consequently, the duad, as a symbol of separation, becomes a proper emblem of man's division from truth, and separation is appropriately the symbol of interval. Interval between objects is measured in distance. Interval between qualities is measured qualitatively. But wherever interval or distance exists, the duad is inevitable. All lines must have ends. All separate things must have intervals. And if intervals shall cease, separation shall cease. Therefore, interval becomes the great abyss which man must cross in his effort to be restored to a universal state. To be divided from God is to exist in a state of separation from reality. And separation is a state dissimilar. Thus, in the Pythagorean thinking, among the key words which they themselves have left is this word dissimilarity, which I think conveys a great deal if we want to think about it. We hope that each one of you will think about these words later and see how they are the elements of a very profound series of speculations concerning the nature of being and illusion. Now, the third number, or the archetypal triad, or equivalent to the number 3, was to the Pythagoreans the symbol of wisdom. Why is it the symbol of wisdom? Because wisdom is moderation. And moderation is between extremes. Therefore, out of the concept of extremes and moderation, we develop a trident, or a three-pronged instrument, in middle point is equidistant from the extremity. This point is wisdom, because wisdom is equidistant from all extremities. Extremities, as we told you in an earlier lecture, are always represented as phases of dissimilarity, therefore are essentially negative. We do not say that good is opposed to evil. This is a dissimilarity that is illusional. We say that two evils are opposed to each other, and that between them is a point of equilibrium, which is truth or reality. Therefore, the cynocephalous ape in Egypt, the symbol of the human mind, is always seated on the beam of the balance of judgment in order that it may represent equilibrium. Wisdom is equilibrium of mind. Wisdom is the ability of the individual to reconcile divided parts by reason. Is therefore such divisions as appear to exist in nature are overcome by the rational power of man, who is able to discover unity as a spiritual experience. To discover unity is to reconcile opposites. And all opposites are reconciled in a neutral state, or a state in which no polarity dominates. Wisdom, then, is equidistant between two kinds of ignorance. Ignorance and wisdom are not opposite, because there are two kinds of ignorance. The first, the state of unknowing, and the second, the state of false knowing. These two, then, must both be reconciled. That which is not knowing must be elevated. That which is wrong knowing must be dissipated or reduced to a common ground. In the same way, virtue is in equilibrium between vices. For there are vices of excess and vices of privation. Each individual, for instance, in an economic situation, can have too much or too little. Both of these extremes are unfortunate. Moderation is fortunate. We also observe that great fortune frequently destroys. Great misfortune frequently perfects. Thus, we cannot place any polarity in this way. Wisdom is the reconciler, the ordinator. Wisdom is represented by triads, because in these we have balance. And a triangle is a balanced form, and is the least form which can enclose an area, the circle always being infinite form. Thus the triangle, if it be equilateral, represents also the primary parts of man, consciousness, intelligence, and force, in equilibrium. And these together constitute wisdom. For his wisdom is, as Socrates said, the recognition of the one, the beautiful, and the good. Then it represents a balance in which no part can be deficient without destroying all. Virtues were therefore regarded as triads. The greatest of all virtues is wisdom, because wisdom is the virtue which perfects or makes possible the rational discovery of truth. Thus the term wisdom is appropriate to the triad. Now the next one is a little difficult, but it requires a discrimination on the part of the student. For the four, or the tetrad, archetypally speaking, is the Pythagorean symbol of intellect, and we come for a moment to pause and consider the difference between wisdom and intellect. We must make this discrimination at this point. The four, in its largest sense of the word, was what the Pythagoreans called the little holy number. And among many ancient peoples, the four was the symbol of God. The four, as the fourth number, is considered in a sequence, following the tetractys, or the groups of dots. The 1 plus the 2 plus the 3 plus the 4 equals the 10. And as the 10 is the most sacred of all numbers, 4 represents the least number by which the 10 can be produced by mathematical sequence or simple addition. 4, therefore, carries with it the symbolism of the forces or powers in the universe by which the material creation was brought into existence. The 4, therefore, was also called the demiurgic number, or the number of the mental or intellectual regent of the universe. Following the Orphic theology, to which we must refer at this time, we recognize a hierarchy or a descent of deities. We know, for example, that the Orphics represented the supreme being under the name of Uranus, or heaven. That Uranus, in turn, lost the kingdom to Cronus, the god of time. And Cronus, in turn, was dethroned by his own son, Zeus. Zeus, or the Latin Jupiter, thus becomes the demiurgic power. For according to the Greeks, it was Zeus who created the mundane universe and is embodied in it. Uranus created the spiritual universe. Saturn created the psychic or soul universe, and Zeus created the mundane or material world. And therefore, this great material creation is the body of the Demiurgus, or the Lord of the Cosmocrators, or creators of the world. This Zeus is then the third person of a creative triad, and is the power which represents the active principle in nature. The universe being created by will, which is spirit, wisdom, which is the psychic nature, and action, which is the material power. Zeus or Jupiter represents the active or objective principle, or the emergence of life from and in form. Thus he is called the formator, and is so recognized in most systems. Among 72 different peoples, according to the Kabbalah, the name of the deity responsible for creation contains 4 letters or characters. These letters or characters are called in the Hebrew form the tetragrammaton, or the name of 4 letters. And this always implies the third logos, or the creating power of the material universe. The ancients generally regarded and revered the number 4 because it represented the elements, the direction, and of course, when presented in cruciform, represents the 4 arms of a cross, either an actual cross or St. Andrew's cross. The cross was, of course, the symbol of matter or of materiality, and it is therefore the cross upon which the Logos or the Christos is crucified. The The cross represents the material world and also bodies and the four instruments of science or knowledge. For the Pythagoreans held that man possesses four powers by means of which he is capable of orienting himself in the material world. We say intellect is different from wisdom, inasmuch as man can think, but thinking does not necessarily imply the achievement of wisdom. The world intellect corresponds to the concrete mind of man. Therefore, the number 4 represents mind focused in matter, and this is termed intellect. Whereas the number 3 represents mind focused in a superior state, therefore abstract or creative mind. Intellect rationalizes, but wisdom is not possible without understanding, and understanding implies the living, vital experience of a thing. The mind, therefore, contemplates. Wisdom is the production of contemplation plus internal experience, or apperception through psychic power within man's own nature. Wisdom is a state of knowing, whereas the intellect leads to remembering, to thinking, and may also end in disputes or dissension. By mind, man builds the world. By wisdom, he perfects himself. They are not the same thing, although in many respects they may appear to be quite similar. Wisdom represents an attribute of God. Mind represents a limited manifestation of this attribute in man or in some created being having a separate intellectual nature. The Greeks, therefore, used two terms to represent wisdom and intellect. One of these was intelligible and the other intellectual. Intelligible being or knowing is that in which knowledge is inherent and cannot be separated. An intellectual being is one in which knowledge must be acquired or must be the result of some process apart from inherency. Thus, certain orders of superior beings are intelligible because they move from a source of wisdom within themselves, whereas man is an intellectual because he moves toward a source of wisdom about which and of which he is not yet able to know completely or perfectly. The intellect aspires to attain wisdom. The wisdom principle itself is therefore an end of intellect. When we say the intellect brings with it the possibility of wisdom, we then clearly distinguish between the two states. An individual who has remembered a well-known scientific thesis may be called intelligent, but he is not necessarily wise. For wisdom is a dynamic. Wisdom is much more than thought. Wisdom is possible because man is capable of attaining it. But we may say with Pythagoras that wisdom is archetypal and exists whether there is anyone to know it or not. Thus, intellect depends upon wisdom, but wisdom does not depend upon intellect. Wisdom is a reality in itself. It can perhaps be aspired to by intellect. Whether there be a mind or not, truth remains. this is the essential difference between the power of the triad and the power of the tetrad. The archetypal 5 is called the pentad, and this is the symbol of equilibrium in a little different way. The triad is wisdom. The pentad is equilibrium in function or in existence. It is a balance of forces rather than a state of consciousness. All forces and elements in nature strive toward equilibrium. In creatures with certain spiritual endowments, this equilibrium may result in wisdom. But in creatures of another kind, or in orders of life different from those we recognize, there is what is termed equilibrium. And equilibrium is the bringing of